Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBS. I'm Cynthia Hessin. This is Colorado's State of Mind. Tonight from iNews at Rocky Mountain PBS, we'll follow up on the Colorado Black Roundtable Summit, which happened last Saturday. And later from iNews, an update on a Colorado delegation headed to Washington to advocate for change in the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. Also tonight, our colleague Mary MacCarthy of Feature Story News has recently returned from Cameroon, ranked among the most corrupt nations on the planet. Mary will tell us how that affects journalism and the information that's available in that Central African country. But let's begin with Burt Hubbard, our editorial director, and the Losing Ground Summit in Denver last weekend. This was organized by the Colorado Black Roundtable in response to the iNews series Losing Ground. A couple of weeks ago here on the program, we had the people behind the event, Dr. Sharon Bailey, state legislators Angela Williams and Mike Johnston, and also John Bailey. And then Burt and I and our iNews crew spent the day there last Saturday. A major part of this summit was a series of panels featuring community and political leaders. Burt and Laura Frank presented the Losing Ground findings once again, and as a matter of fact, we now have updated numbers on those findings.
That's correct. We looked at, before we had gone through 2010, so we looked at 2012 census figures, which had just come out, and there was some improvement in the education gaps.
That's
For the
good.
first time in decades, the gap between African American and white adults went down. And so Colorado no longer has the largest gap. It's still third largest, but it's still an improvement. And we found also a narrowing of the gaps in high school education. Unfortunately, we found the gaps going the other way for things like poverty and family income.
So those things became wider
Yes,
gaps.
unfortunately, yes. Mm-hmm.
And this, of course, is what all these people came together to talk about on Saturday. They were struck by this earlier in the year when the report first came out, and there was some movement in the legislature even.
Yes, and in fact, what happened at the summit, which was interesting, is that there was a concerted effort to look forward instead of looking backwards and saying why, who's to blame, etc. It was looking forward. And so John and Sharon Bailey basically told all the speakers, come with a recommendation or idea to deal with these gaps. And so you had a lot of ideas come out, and in fact almost a whole legislative agenda was sort of announced during there. They're going to take a look at the minimum wage. They're going to take a look at disparities. They want to try to do a state study on disparities in state contracts. Education was a big topic of conversation. They want to try to do more of flowing kids from K through 12 education all the way to college. The emphasis needs to be on college, a lot of the panelists said, because that's what type of degree you need if you really want to succeed in the 21st, 22nd century. Economic issues were a big deal. They were looking at how can minority companies and workers get a bigger share of all these public works projects, highways, RTD, etc. And they even went back and were looking at, how can we get our kids started right as far as maybe guaranteeing public public preschool for low-income families. So a lot of ideas were thrown out during the conference. It was interesting.
It really was. I was in on the first panel. Mayor Michael Hancock was on that one, several high-profile people. Did you feel like Michael Hancock came to the table with some concrete things that are already underway?
It was interesting because what the mayor did was he wanted to emphasize the fact that they really need to look at family structure and look at the fact that the fathers need to be into the homes, because that's been a big issue in a lot of low-income minority families. And so that was his emphasis. How do we deal with that issue?
And what were some of the ideas there? That seems a delicate thing for government to wade into.
It is, and that's when they started getting more specific as far as, job programs. Incarceration rates were a big issue of conversation. It was interesting because you had the police chief of Denver there, Robert White, versus some community activists who thought too many people were going to prison. So there was a lot of give and take on what role incarceration was playing in the family structure. community and churches, what was their role in bringing families together. So there was a lot of interesting conversation going on.
I'll say quite a spectrum of people. And in fact, I was impressed. I got to talk to some of these people afterwards. There were a number of young people who were there to try and help with young black men and what their role and responsibility should be and so forth. So here's a look at some of the other people that I talked to.
Yeah, for me, overcoming poverty is not a task for charity. Overcoming poverty for me is an act of justice. And I think that's what we heard today, is that we need to take on justice for people who are poor.
As Dr. Bailey talked about, one of the things we're doing now is working in silos, where several elected officials are doing good things, but how do we partner together so that we can have a greater impact? I mentioned, for example, financial literacy. How do we put programs in place so that our children know how to better manage their finances? So as we can increase their wages so that they can earn more money, but if you don't know how to manage it responsibly to be a good steward, it's not going to help you. We don't teach financial literacy in our classes. So one of the things I talked about is how do we have programs for those kids, but I'm doing that in one silo in far northeast Denver. We should partner together across our city, across our state, so that we can have a greater benefit as opposed to just doing individual things in our respective districts.
There's an inertia in the business community. So anytime you set up a program, there's this overwhelming counterforce of the major industry that goes in and lobbies perpetually and continually, okay? So small companies are so busy running around trying to get their business done and do their work and get contracts and collect that they don't have time to do that. So what happens is that just like in a lot of government agencies, the agencies are set up to govern and manage the industry, but what happens is they become captive of the industry. And so they reflect the industry. And so if you look at any of the major in the state, city, local, minorities and women get a much lower percentage of business opportunities than they represent in the population.
We understand and know that rec centers in this city alone, and I'm not talking about any other city, were really built to be the soul of a community, a place where folks came together, a place that kids could be engaged in organized recreational programming, maybe get tutorial services, maybe have access to a computer, as well as adults who cared about their well-being. The cost of what we were getting from the young people, the cost of memberships, the revenue that was generated to help offset some of the costs of rec center programs was minuscule compared to the cost of dealing with these kids when they're not involved in our rec programs.
When you think about the Colorado paradox that you know, in less than 20 years, you know, the majority of our population, you know, and the kids coming up, they're going to be kids of color. And they're the ones who drive not only our economy, and I think somebody made a really good point in the panel today. This is not just about, you know, a jobs factory. This is about the young people who are going to be the leaders in our community. They're going to be making the decisions. They're going to be our teachers. They are our future in every respect.
As Burt said earlier, John and Sharon Bailey did just a remarkable job pulling this all together. And as you say, looking for the solutions, not the... I remember Angela Williams said, I don't want to talk about this again and just lament what's going on. I want to do something.
That's right. Everyone was sort of forward-thinking, forward-looking. I mean, there was, you know, perceptions that, you know, some of the energy from the civil rights movement had been lost during the subsequent decades. But they were really looking forward. And one thing that came out loud and clear is that a lot of the community and political leaders thought they had to be more aggressive in pushing sort of their agendas and what they think are their policies. And so one of the first things they're really going to be looking at is pushing to have a czar formed in Denver to actually deal with a lot of these gaps and find out what are some of the things they can do to try to narrow these things.
This would be somebody that Michael Hancock would appoint?
Correct. That's correct, yeah. So I think you're going to, that could come out in the future. I think you're going to see a lot more with aggressiveness as far as, you know, going to RTD and the highway department and making sure that some of these public works projects do employ minority firms. I think you're going to be seeing education issues pushed quite a bit. I know that everyone was going to get behind this state ballot measure on funding education type of thing. So I think you're going to see a lot more aggressive, forward-looking action.
Now, of course, Denver has the largest concentration of minority residents in the state, but certainly not all of them. Maybe the biggest thing that could affect minorities in the other parts of the state is this idea of doing away with disparities in contract awarding at the state level. That's correct. Yeah, I mean, Aurora is a major player in this whole issue too, because they have a very large minority community right now. Colorado Springs, very large minority community, and so they're going to be pushing to sort of bring up the economic well-being of some of the communities around the state. Thank you very much. Sure. Burt Hubbard, editorial director for iNews at Rocky Mountain PBS. Coming next, journalism in a time of government corruption. We'll talk with Mary MacCarthy next. Here at our Denver offices and studios of Rocky Mountain PBS, we house several different organizations which share our space and our love of learning. One of them is World Denver, and tonight, Karen DeBartolome, founding executive director of World Denver, is here, along with Mary MacCarthy, a reporter of Feature Story News who works in our newsroom. And just recently, Karen let Mary know of an unusual opportunity to help abroad, and so Mary spent a week in Cameroon. Why did you do that?
That's right. I went to Cameroon for a full week to teach local journalists about how to cover elections, sort of in the Western tradition that we have of covering elections in a fair, balanced, informed manner. So it was a terrific opportunity. Cameroon is in Central Africa, part of the world I'd never been to, and one of the reasons that I was selected to go was because it's a primarily French-speaking nation. I did much of my career in France, and I do speak French fluently. And I brought my video camera with me, and I prepared a little sneak peek into the classroom activities to give a sense of the country, and particularly of these fascinating, brilliant journalists that I was able to work with.
All right, let's take a look, and then we'll talk more.
Cameroon is home to some 20 million people. Its capital, Yaoundé, is nicknamed the City of Seven Hills for its location in a mountainous inland spot that offers some relief from the heat of equatorial temperatures. And the country's biggest city is the business capital, Douala, a bustling port known as the richest city in all of Central Africa. In mid-August, journalists from both cities attended training sessions organized by the U.S. Embassy. The goal of the workshops was to learn and review the best journalistic practices when it comes to covering elections. This ahead of a key parliamentary and local vote scheduled for later this fall. Over 4 days, they engaged in heated discussion.
Ah bon? On vous a dit ça?
Cameroon has what appears to be a rich media landscape, with dozens of daily papers, countless radio stations, and a growing number of television networks. On the surface, there seems to be an abundance and diversity of voices.
Pratiquement en fin de match, sur un coup franc du capitaine Pierre Womelinde.
But that belies a darker reality. Most media outlets are strongly influenced by the ruling party or by other vested interests. The vast majority of Cameroonian reporters, editors, and publishers face constant pressure when it comes to deciding what stories to tell and how to tell them. In the workshops, the journalists acted out political interviews, exploring what the main issues are that should be covered during the election season.
Roads, water, energy. Under-scholarization is one of the things that we have to have very hard on.
They also practiced avoiding traps set by smooth-talking politicians.
Je suis citoyen camerounais, natif de ce département de la Vallée. J'ai une vie.
The deep divide between members of Cameroon's French and English-speaking communities became obvious in the classroom, with this politician refusing to answer in English despite the journalist's request that he do so.
Anyway, I will just speak in French, and I hope that you accept that for me. Thank you very much. Okay, vous avez présenté tout à l'heure mon mandat.
In impassioned discussions that carried over well into lunchtime, the journalists in attendance said they were determined to offer neutral, balanced coverage of the upcoming election, despite the challenges of working under a repressive regime and in a profession marred by widespread corruption.
Karen, this is through a program that World Denver knows about, or actually, why don't you explain that exactly?
Sure. Well, we're the U.S. State Department designated host agency for visitors in Colorado, and particularly in the Denver area. And as a result of that relationship, we often get special requests to identify Americans who have special talents and abilities that can fill some of the State Department need. As you know, our State Department tries to promote democracy, and the media plays a key role in making sure that societies are open and democratic. So I was kind of putting out my feelers in our network to see if we could find someone who was fluent in French and skilled in journalism and experienced in covering elections. And here in the building, I found Mary MacCarthy, which was a very lucky break.
Mary, as you made clear in the video, journalism is not the same there. They don't have the freedom to ask the same questions. Their population doesn't get the same kind of information.
That's right, because Cameroon is technically not a dictatorship. They do have what they call multi-party elections for the past 20 years or so, but they've had the same president for 30 years, which gives the sense that, those aren't necessarily fair elections. They do tend to be rigged. But
there are parties, there are elections. It's just that he always wins.
He always wins, and there's always maneuvering going on to ensure that the ruling party stays in power. So as a journalist, to go into a system where teaching journalists, you're supposed to do this, you're supposed to provide fair, informed, accurate coverage, in a system where they can't really do that. The government strictly controls who gets access to what information. Some journalists, the ones who are closer to the government, will get access to particular people, but overall, they can't work in the same way that you and I work. And it really struck me how privileged we are as journalists in the West, perhaps in the United States more than anywhere, where, what you do every week is even outside of a campaign season, you're informing viewers in Colorado, bringing them information so that when they go to the ballot box, they make that the choices, an informed choice. And the fact is, when you're not working in a democracy, no matter how hard the journalists work and how much they want to do a good job, and even if the U.S. Embassy pays, for these trainings, bringing people in, they still can't really do the same job that you and I do. They're working in a very corrupt system, not only pressure from the government and, censorship from the government, but also from, a number of vested interests, corporations that are pressuring them, bribing them, intimidating them all the time. So it really takes a courageous spirit to even try to do the profession that you and I do.
That's right. You said that what they make in their jobs is nothing compared to an envelope of cash they might be handed to make a story come out a certain way.
That's right. Even the sort of well-paid journalists make very little. One of them I spoke to, who was sort of one of the most senior journalists who was there, and he said he makes $250 a month. With that, he's supposed to support his wife and his 3 children. And in a country like Cameroon, you simply can't live on that. So many of them have to live, either from, say, family money or come from the wealthier classes, and or what most of them are doing, unfortunately, is accepting bribes because, they're getting handed envelopes of cash right, left, and center in order to, then unfortunately write or publish things that are going one direction or another. So a completely different media landscape. But there was a lot of optimism to see that these journalists, the younger ones and the more senior ones, do want to do the proper work of journalists despite all these challenges. It really takes again a lot of spirit, a lot of courage, and I don't know if it makes our job look very easy. I don't know if we'd be able to live up to those challenges. Exactly.
Yes. Karen, why would the government of Cameroon allow this to happen in Cameroon? Let them get Western information like this?
Well, I think all governments like to appear to be open, at least on the surface, and the U.S. Embassy, obviously is promoting democracy. Wherever we are, we're sharing our values, our American values, with the people that are around us. So I think Cameroon is not such a closed nation like maybe North Korea or Iran or some other nations where this kind of thing just wouldn't be permitted. I think it is a more open and at least at some level wants to appear to be a democratic country. And I think also the diplomats that work out of the embassy they have to create the space in which they work. They have to create an atmosphere of trust, and that their interests are not in conflict with the interests of the Cameroonian people. And obviously, they've been able to do that by creating the opportunity to hold this kind of a training. I was struck with something that Mary shared. I think at the level, when you start talking about our values in a democratic society, I think you mentioned that that there was a way in which this was a bit of a new idea, that they should be covering both sides of a campaign.
Right, what we take for granted, this idea that you're supposed to hear from all candidates on all sides. To them as journalists, that was the light bulbs were going off. It was eye-opening.
Right, and I think, that's it's so important for us to share our values, because you never know when something that we are, it's the air we breathe. We don't think about, that a journalist might not see that as a core value. It's so ingrained in our view of our democracy and our society that Mary goes to Cameroon and it's a surprise that somebody wouldn't just take this for granted. We find that a lot in our work with the International Visitor Leadership Program, that things that we completely take for granted come as a new information. So, for example, volunteering. I know this is another value that we share with Channel 6. You all have a lot of volunteers. World Denver has a lot of volunteers. We kind of take it for granted that people volunteer in their societies, and this is not a value that is understood or shared around the world. So it's important for us to, send our Marys to Cameroon and say those things, even if they might be obvious to us. They might not be obvious.
And it might plant some sort of seed for the future.
Oh, absolutely. And the great thing about the way the media works nowadays is that the work that they do, what I kept telling them was that the world is watching, in this election and the elections coming up. They can get their work out on the internet, which they do already. I push them to put as much of their work on Facebook and Twitter, because that really makes it accessible to the entire world. And then even if their work isn't respected by their peers or, even by the government, and they get pressure, the world can pay attention and encourage that work, like the U.S. is doing, the U.S. Embassy is doing, and the rest of the world. So with the changing media landscape technology, it's opening the way for so many changes within regimes like this.
Well, what a very worthy export from Colorado. And I'm glad the two of you could come and tell us about it. Mary MacCarthy and Karen De Bartolome. Before we close this evening, a follow-up to an iNews story from 2010, which found that thousands of Coloradans with disabilities could live independently and often less expensively if tax dollars were spent on home care instead of nursing homes. Since that time, Colorado has received a federal grant that allows money to follow a person from an institution into home care, a step that is intended to make that transition easier. But a lack of affordable and accessible housing has meant that some people who want to live outside of nursing facilities simply have no place to go. A group of Coloradans, including Dawn Russell, are among several hundred people from the disability rights organization ADAPT, who are traveling to Washington, D.C. this week to ask Congress to strengthen the rights of those with disabilities to live in the community.
Absolutely. If you were to go out and ask anybody today, you would find it would be hard to find someone that would say, I'd rather live in an institution than my own home.
Our newest iNews at Rocky Mountain PBS reporter Kristin Jones joins me now, and you have talked with some of these people who are taking this demand to Washington. What are they hoping to accomplish?
Well, housing is a real problem for people because even though there's this legal mandate for housing, what they're seeing is that because of the federal budget sequestration, in part, that's cut off a lot of funding that's usually available for affordable and accessible housing. The other thing that's happening in Colorado is that rental demand has skyrocketed. Vacancies are very low, so that even if there is accessible housing, they're finding that it's very costly.
How does the Americans with Disabilities Act play into this?
The Americans with Disabilities Act has a legal mandate that if people want to live in an integrated setting and in the community, they have that right. So what activists from ADAPT are asking is this state, the Colorado state, take more of an active role in providing housing for people who want to move out of nursing facilities and can't. And they're also going to Congress to ask that the ADA be strengthened so that there are legal remedies for people who want to move out of institutions. Their message is that this is a right, and if it's not happening, then there should be accountability.
Is there anything that keeps them from using tax dollars now on home care?
Well, I mean, the federal grant that Colorado received is intended to make that happen. In other words, for people who are receiving a certain amount of funding in nursing facilities, they should now be able to receive that same level of funding at home. But what people are finding is that there are still a number of barriers in place before that can actually happen.
Kristin, thank you, and I know that we will have more on the story as it progresses. That is all for Colorado State of Mind this week. You may see the whole program again at video.rmpbs.org. And thank you now to iNews reporters Burt Hubbard and Kristin Jones, also to Mary MacCarthy and Karen DeBartolome. Next week, we will bring you our report on a proposed 51st state, North Colorado. This secession movement is going to be on the ballot in 11 Colorado counties in November. We'll talk to some people behind that idea and also have an iNews analysis of the numbers, what the economy would look like in these two new states. So please join us for that next week, and thanks for tuning in this weekend. I'm Cynthia Hessin. Good night.